Chapter 2 Campmates. In the liveliest of spirits we commenced rigging a camp. "I'll cut the tent poles," suggested Charlie as he unpacked the axe, "while you put the billy on. The well must be over there, down by the mangrove edge. See, there is old Tarquet's track. From a rude shelter of wreckage nearby, a track just discernible in the grass led apparently towards the back of the island. I followed expectantly this path, warned by the feet of the Malay and his man Friday. It climbed a few yards to where the bases of the two tiny hills met. 100 yards farther on appeared the edge of a dull green mangrove forest that stretched apparently 2 or 3 miles out to sea. Only mangroves, but a welcome sight, showing that the island was not so very small. Walking down along the grass-lined track, I turned and gazed back at the two hills. They stood up like giants' thumbs, hedged around by an immensity of sea and sky. The call of a bird came pleasantly. The hillsides were scarred by the tiniest of ravines, dark green with dwarf trees whose tops had been flattened by many winds. Everywhere else the little hills slopes appeared green with grass, except for the gray of granite boulders reflecting the sun. The hill to the right was really a grassy peak. The other was more nuggety, dotted with more boulders and a few more scrubby trees. The area of the island above tidewater would hardly cover 10 acres. It was not a puzzle why centuries of storms had not washed it away. Again a bird trilled greeting away up there, and again it sounded comforting. Turning down the track again, I walked across a patch of gently sloping ground formed by erosion from the peak by wind and rain, where the wall of mangrove trees began. Rich loam this small level patch, for the grass was profuse and green. Then the track led into the gloomy mangroves and the mud itself. Surely there could never be fresh water here. I peered doubtfully among the trees. A sudden fluttering, a chorus of excited chirpings as dripping birds flew up from a circular ring of stones. It was the well, a real mystery of nature, a spring of fresh water welling up from below the saltwater mud. To keep the water sweet, aborigines ages ago had roughly cemented a collar of stones around the spring. This held back the tidal water, which at big tides must rise 2 feet deep around the little protecting wall. But what if the salt tides by some means should rake into the water while we were on the island? Back at the camp, Charlie already had the tent rigged, sheltered from the sea winds by the mangroves that hedged the miniature beach. To the right the peak rose straight up, to the left the hill. Behind was a ridge, only a mound of earth, that connected the peak and the hill. If the island had been an envelope and the tent a postage stamp, Charlie could not have placed the camp in a more correct position. He had been very busy too. I laughed to the implied reproach of the fiercely burning fire. "You've certainly got a move on." "Yes, we must rig our bunks before sundown," he growled. "Put the billy on, and I'll open this tin of beef. Some of that long grass will be just the thing for a mattress. We might as well make ourselves comfortable." We enjoyed that meal, sitting there with the water lapping the beach not 20 feet away. Charlie thoughtfully munched, his eyes on the wreckage caught in the roots of the mangroves. "The sea foam?" I inquired. "Yes, some of it. There's flotsam, though, along the beach and in among the rocks. That must have drifted in from hundreds of miles away. There's enough timber close handy to build a comfortable hut. We won't want it. We'll be gone in a month." Charlie stared at an inquisitive crab that was watching us from the sea edge. By sundown we had the camp fixed snug. Charlie's bunk was neat and shipshape. Mine was rigged any old how. "Let's inspect our kingdom," I suggested. It's not often 2 men can boast they own a whole island between them. So we climbed the peak, a grassy cone 280 feet high. From the summit our kingdom lay spread out below. Westward the setting sun stained miles of rolling sea a glittering pink. Dimly to south and west, like a tracery of clouds, were mountains forming an uninhabited portion of the mainland coast. South, several dark clouds on the water were really islands. North, too, just distinguishable, were others. East, like a gigantic, rapidly blackening carpet, stretched from our feet the mangrove forest, its farther edge dimming in the sea. Windings of dulling silver glimpse through the treetops were salt-water creeks. It promised some weird exploring, that mangrove forest. Then we realized with pleasant surprise that we owned a third hill, 1,000 yards east of the sea edge of the mangroves, a bare rocky knoll about 60 feet high. We christened it straightaway the Mound. Connecting it now to our two hills, we exposed a portion of the reef like a broad roadway 1,000 yards long. From the outgoing tide, the water was now rushing out the mangroves and over it, back into the sea. A low tide, it would be quite easy to walk along the reef and explore the Mound, and also the adjoining coral shore and mangroves. Enthusiastically, we pointed out to each other what a lot of country we really had to explore when the tide was out. Darkness fell quickly, bringing up to us the murmur of the sea. We stood a while in the cool evening, watching the stars peep out. Rather a lonely feeling grew upon us. The island was so small, there was such a very little of it above water. We were so far from anywhere and anybody. We returned down through the grass to the campfire, twinkling between the two hills, and to its cheery crackling put the billy on again. Charlie started whistling. Night closed softly round us. Charlie sat staring into the fire, sipping his final pannikin of tea. Wavelets lapped amongst the mangrove roots on the tiny beach. Beyond these frontal trees gleamed a baby lagoon, and from out beyond came the slumberous murmur of lazy waves rolling on its encircling reef. The camp is well protected. I believe we could last out a cyclone here. I remarked, blowing smoke lazily up towards the sky. Yes, growled Charlie, so long as a man did not stand up or move 20 feet away from this hollow. If he did, he'd be blown into the lagoon, or else back over the little bank and into the mangrove forest behind. Ever been in a cyclone up north? Charlie slowly filled his pipe. He lit it with a coal from the fire before answering, just lifted the live coal with his fingers as natives do. Yes, on the Rocky River diggings during the Camp Melville cyclone. The goldfield is right up in the mountains in the jungle. 9 men were penned under trees that night. Must have been a nasty experience. It was. In the dead of night, the wind flattened the jungle. That roar was worse than any gunfire I ever heard in France. There were no trenches in that jungle, and nowhere to run to, only darkness and howling rain and falling trees. The swelling creeks were soon dammed by falling trees, then they spilled over, burst the dams, and sent the trees crashing into the gorges. Men lay flat all night, clinging to lawyer canes, and couldn't see a thing, only hear roaring water and crashing trees. It was hell in the morning. The jungle was uprooted trees piled 12 feet high. He talked for 2 hours of hard times, struggles in the wild places of the continent, of finds of tin and wolfram and gold, of lonely wanderings in the heart of the Musgraves, his whereabouts known only to the blacks. Have you ever found a rich gold show, Charlie? No worse luck. I found some promising shows and knocked a living out of them, but never a fortune. I've always done better at wolfram. What was the best show you ever found? Nothing to the one I never found. I thought I could buy up all the millionaires in the world. I yelled at the mountain. I reckon I went mad for a while. It was near a favorite camp of mine, away out in the Musgraves. No one but niggers anywhere handy. It was wild country, all mountains and ravines and gorges. And I found a mountain of rubies. I nearly went crazy. A big gorge ran on down past the mountain, and from an old dry river bed in it I washed a dish of dirt, and it was half full of rubies. I wore the skin off my fingers washing the rubble. When the fingertips were red raw, I had to knock off. Then I traced the rubies to the mountain. The whole mountain was full of them, like blood-red plums in a mountain of hard gray dough. I was richer than Sinbad the Sailor. From every dish in the river, where the sand was caught against the rock bars, I could wash a shovelful of rubies. I washed a ton of those rich reddish stones, then hand-picked a sugar bag full of the best and largest. I couldn't transport any more, besides I was terribly scared lest someone find out. I daren't land in Cooktown with pack-horse loads of rubies. Anyway, if the mountain was discovered, it would flood the market. Rubies would become as cheap as dirt. I packed those rubies deep down in an old swag and took them overland to Cooktown, caught the steamer, and quietly sailed for Brisbane. When I offered the first handful to a jeweler, and he told me they were garnets, I assaulted him. I offered them to other jewelers. At last they convinced me that they were not conspiring to rob me, so I got drunker than any man had ever been drunk before, and that night from my window rained my rubies down all over Queen Street. Stiff luck, Charlie. That is the biggest disappointment I've ever heard of in mining. I have known men clean up several tons of iron sands, imagining they found a new tin field, but I never heard of finding a mountain of rubies before. A mountain of garnets, answered Charlie grimly. Damn impostors just about broke my heart. Aren't they of any value at all? Very little, hardly worth transportation. There is only a small market for the very pick of them. He yarned then of the Aboriginals. His Aboriginal lore was fascinating. He had lived among the wild tribes. I had too, but he had lived longer and traveled farther, whereas I had 2 half-caste mates, and we traveled with the tribe. He had lived alone among them. He could live in the bush with or apart from the natives, finding his own food. Every man whose livelihood takes him far from civilization for 12 months at a time wishes he could do that, should it ever become a matter of dire necessity. His horses might break away, eat poison weed, or be speared. He might be lost. In any eventuality, when he might suddenly be cut off from foodstuffs, he could thus live. Charlie could, my half-caste mates and I had, but differently. After the tribe had eaten our provisions, they fed us, as the most natural thing in the world to do. I had walked with them for months after month, accompanying the bucks on the hunt, watching the women seeking vegetable foods and fruit. Charlie had learnt to do these things for himself, and what is more, to locate and prepare and cook vegetable foods. Numbers of vegetable foods contain poisonous substances, and the blacks are adepts at the sometimes intricate treatment necessary to rid these foods of their poisons. Few white men can live on native foods, except in favored localities. It is awful stuff, but to know how to do so in case of emergency may mean the difference between life and death to a bushman. It was intensely interesting listening to this man, who must have had a lot of primitive in him. It was in his husky voice as he talked, in the firelit glow of his eyes, as he told of native vendettas, of the animal scream of a buck awakening with a spear between his ribs. He spoke of a night when he had crawled into the darkness to find in daylight his sleeping place riddled with spears. He told of gold niggers and bad niggers, and of the iron rule of the old men over all the tribe, of the sure death of the young lubra who runs away with a lover, of the jungle law, of an eye for an eye. Listening, I wondered how much of that law he had imbibed himself. He talked until the fire burned low, then stared at the coals. He answered several questions, but grew almost morose, as is natural in a man recovering from the drink. Yawning, I enjoyed a final pipe, then, slipping off my trousers, rolled in under the blanket.